Good evening, everyone. My name is Chip Gibbons, and I am the Policy Director of Defending Rights in Dissent. I thank you for joining us. I know this has been a very tumultuous week, especially for people like myself who live in Washington, D.C. I was both prepared and unprepared for the events that transpired yesterday. But it's also been a tumultuous week for the Julian Assange extradition case, and tonight we are joined by Kevin Gastala. Kevin is the managing editor of Shadowproof. He is one of the journalists who are credentialed to cover the Assange extradition hearings. This is the third time he's joined us for an update, and they've all been very informative, and we're always happy to have him back. Kevin, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
So there's been a lot of mixed decisions this week, and I want to go through all of them. But let's start out with, on Monday, the judge denied extradition to the U.S. What was her reasoning, and what were the arguments from the defense she accepted, and what were those she rejected, and what are the implications of this for both Julian and press freedom? A convoluted question, but you know what I'm asking.
Yeah, no, and I think I can satisfy and answer all three of those questions by outlining what the decision was,
Please do.
Which Judge Vanessa Baraitser issued. And so this was the British District Court. Just to be clear, in the process, it's the lowest court, and now it'll head to an appeal because naturally the U.S. government does not accept that the extradition request was rejected. We do not have a date yet for the appeal, and so we don't know when that will be unfolding and playing out. But what we do know is that she rejected just about all of the arguments put forward by the defense. Things that were said by the defense about how Julian Assange engaged in standard news gathering practices, those were rejected by the judge. And anything that was said about how this was a political case, that was rejected. But what she did agree was something that she was willing to give merit was the mental health issues which were presented. And that came from doctors who had diagnosed Julian Assange with a recurring depressive disorder, who had diagnosed him as being on the autism spectrum. And so as far as our conversation about press freedom and whistleblowing goes, and the rights of journalists, etc., and what people who follow defending rights in dissent will care about is essentially someone who has been held in arbitrary detention in some way or another for the last 10 years and endured what the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Meltzer, has described as psychological torture. He was deemed unfit to be sent to the United States' prison system because it would be cruel and inhumane, and he would be put under conditions, likely sent to ADX Florence, a supermax prison in Colorado. He would there further deteriorate. He has a commitment and already is considered a bit of a suicide risk at Belmarsh High Security Prison, where he's been detained since April 2019. And the judge agreed that he would likely consider taking his life if he was in the supermax prison, and the authorities in that prison would likely fail to stop him from committing suicide. And so she decided to reject the extradition request on those grounds.
And you've commented about this on the Twitter of that sort of the U.S. government's renewed persecution of Chelsea Manning ultimately undermined their attempt to extradite Julian Assange. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I found this to be fascinating because it speaks to how the overzealousness of the Justice Department essentially sunk their case. We see mentioned in there, in addition to the fact that Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide in a prison, we see in addition to that the mention that Chelsea Manning attempted suicide in the Alexandria Detention Center. And why this would be important to the judge is that the Alexandria Detention Center is where Julian Assange would be held before and during the U.S. trial that would take place. He'd be held in the the Eastern District of Virginia, which is where that grand jury was empaneled, where Chelsea Manning was jailed for about a year simply for resisting a grand jury subpoena when she was called to testify against Assange and other members of WikiLeaks. And so this is significant. They could have always left Chelsea alone. They could have set her free. It didn't have to get to the point where she attempted suicide in the same facility where they would inevitably have to bring Julian Assange. And yet she made the suicide attempt that now becomes a factor in them losing their case.
And the conditions at the Alexander Detention Center are quite heinous. I know a number of other quote-unquote high-profile detainees have been held in solitary confinement there. Paul Manafort, an alleged Russian agent as well. And when Manning was there defending rights and dissent, joined with a number of groups in sending a confidential, we didn't publish this, it was a confidential request to the UN Special Rapporteur to investigate and intervene in Chelsea Manning's case with the permission of her counsel. So it was something that was very concerning to us, the conditions that Manning was in, and for Assange to go to that same prison, jail, we would have a lot of concerns about that. So Kevin, you've probably paid attention to this case more than just about anybody besides the defense team. Were you surprised on Monday?
Yes. In fact, I cursed in one of my tweets simply because I couldn't believe that I heard the words out of the judge's mouth that I am satisfied that if Julian Assange was extradited to the United States, that that basically the U.S. would fail to prevent him from committing suicide. I'm paraphrasing, but yeah. to hear it put in that stark terms, and she hadn't said what was going to be the kicker, which was that thing that made it real, which was, and therefore I'm not going to allow extradition because it would be oppressive for mental health reasons. And at that point, I knew that this had taken a turn entirely unexpected. You listened to the entire ruling. I did as someone who was a credentialed reporter. I was up very, very early in the United States paying close attention. And it took about 30 minutes, I think, for her to get to this part of her summary of her decision. And so she made very clear that she believes in the entire U.S. government's case and all of their allegations. She believes it's well-founded. She buys into every single bit of the CIA narrative about Julian Assange that has been perpetuated. And yet, the words that she said was that she could not agree to the extradition request, that she could not authorize that extradition request.
Do you think, and I'm asking you to speculate about a jurist now, and if you don't want to do that, that's fine. Do you think she was potentially looking for some sort of way out in this decision, that she didn't want to necessarily invalidate the U.S. case because she does believe in it, but also sort of wanted to wash her hands of the Assange case?
So my view of this is that this was very cunning in the way that Vanessa Baraitser handled the case. I also think it's cowardly and it reflects somebody who does not want to be held responsible for whatever happens to Julian Assange in the United States. And so she issued this decision knowing full well that the U.S. government would appeal the ruling. And in doing so, they would go to the High Court of Justice, which is a panel. It's not a single judge who's going to be reviewing and determining whether to uphold the appeal. And so what does this do? If the High Court decides that she was wrong in the way that she ruled, she can accept that because she at least is, not going to be responsible if Julian Assange goes to the United States. It's going to be the High Court of Justice that is responsible. So then if Julian Assange commits suicide in a supermax prison, the blood is going to be on the High Court of Justice. It's not going to be on Vanessa Baretzer's hands. And in that sense, the rest of her career, she doesn't have to fear that she is going to be labeled as somebody guilty for doing some kind of heinous act to a journalist. She's well aware of all the people around the world at this point. She knows that there are press freedom organizations that object. She knows there are human rights organizations like Amnesty International that object to the way Julian Assange has been treated. She knows there are parliamentarians in countries in Europe, particularly, that have wanted to follow this closely. In fact, I want to say the Human Rights Commissioner in Germany sent a diplomatic note to the UK government opposing extradition just a day or two before this was to be handed down, just before, maybe it was a few more days, but, issued this, which was unusual. I mean, Germany had held back and been silent, but there's been campaigning there that led the government to take a more formal position of expressing concern about this case. She does not want to be held responsible. And so this is a very convenient way. And I think that is how we begin to understand why Julian Assange is not free right now, why he's still in the Belmarsh high security.
I want to get to that in a minute. Yeah. But so let's assume for a minute that her decision is upheld on appeal. That would be ultimately good for Julian Assange because he would get to not be extradited to the U.S. What would be the implications, though, for press freedom, assuming the decision in its entirety is upheld on appeal? I know this is hypothetical, but...
Right. And there might be one other court that this could go to. So we don't know. And to some degree, some of this gets complicated by Brexit, potentially, or maybe not. I've heard conflicting views about what would happen next. So in any case, what the implication is for press freedom is that because there has been so little outrage from organizations in the U.S., at least they've done the bare minimum. They ran the op-ed, they stated their position, and they moved on and pretended not to care about things as it unfolded and not to care too much because they didn't want to appear too supportive of Julian Assange, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, other places, et cetera, et cetera. And the implication here is that this is going to be a green light for the U.S. government going forward. I mean, this judge said that all of these arguments can stand. You can bring an Espionage Act case against a journalist or publisher if you believe that what they've done has gone beyond journalism. And that's subject to the government's own interpretation of what journalistic activity is. But she's allowing the government to decide what is and is not journalism. And they are narrowing the spectrum of acceptable acts in the digital age. And that is going to put a chill out there throughout the world for people who are handling classified documents, secret documents, for people who have sources that are within government agencies, especially if they're within security agencies or military agencies. I imagine that would make people more leery about what they're doing. I guess it depends on the operation that might be at stake, what would be exposed. It creates a whole host of issues for all kinds of people who up to this point had been mostly silent. This is now the time to speak up because it's only going to fester and get worse. I don't want to go too far off on a tangent, but as far as global press freedom goes, you look at the United Kingdom, you look at the the country of Australia, and these are both countries that could have taken strong positions in defense of Julian Assange, and they've been quiet. I mean, Australia, Julian Assange is an Australian citizen, and they've done little to protect him from this prosecution. UK has allowed this to go on, and as far as global press freedom goes, there are examples in both those countries of the deterioration of freedom of information. There's examples there where, like for me, there are cases right now where people one journalist, Stefania Marizzi, in Italy, who was actually a target of the spying operation against Julian Assange while he was in the embassy, has filed a Freedom of Information Act request about what the government was doing behind the scenes in relation to Assange. And she's been blocked, and there's an open case where they might decide that she does not have grounds to request these documents because she is not from the United Kingdom. And
Oh, wow.
so you're seeing a really dramatic shift. And I think Assange is the thing that we all see. It's the lightning rod. But all around it, there are examples that just point to a widespread deterioration of our press freedom. And Rebecca Vincent of Reporters Without Borders, you should consider talking to her at some point if if you could manage the time zone difference, because she's a good voice about what's at stake for human rights and dissent when it comes to journalists. And she's been out front talking about this. And there are media organizations that have been banned by the Ministry of Defense, so they no longer are considered legitimate journalistic organizations. There's a whistleblower case in Australia with David McBride, where he's being prosecuted for exposing war crimes in Afghanistan related to Australian soldiers that were deployed. And so you see, this is just the backdrop. So we all have a responsibility beyond Julian Assange. He's likely to survive. This case is likely to pass, and he might escape the clutches of the United States government. But there's still going to be a lot of really dark, heavy residue, so to speak. There's going to be a residual impact of this case that we are going to be reckoning with for at least the next decade, if not longer.
So we talked what happened on Monday. Let's go to Wednesday. Julian Assange, his extradition to the U.S. was for now blocked, but he's still in Belmarsh prison. Why is that?
Julian Assange is still in Belmarsh prison because, in my view, Vanessa Baraitser has a latent prejudice against Julian Assange. She's adopted the kind of institutional bias that is within the British government. And obviously that bias is learned. It's from them basically acting as a client state of the United States government. Every step of the way here, they've been seeking to serve the intelligence agencies in the US and to help them achieve whatever objectives they want in relation to Julian Assange. And so he has been kept inside the Belmarsh prison, even though London is on lockdown with COVID-19 ripping through the city, and with an outbreak inside his wing of the prison. I think when we consider issues that have to do with civil liberties, I was troubled by the justification that she accepted, the argument put forward by the prosecution that WikiLeaks helped Edward Snowden get out of Hong Kong, and were willing to help Edward Snowden try to reach Ecuador to obtain asylum. Of course, the State Department revoked his passport, and he became stuck in a Moscow airport. But she referenced this as a reason why he could not be trusted to show up for his appeal date. And that's part of why he was denied the placement on house arrest. The defense even offered to put a GPS tracking device, like an ankle tag, on Julian Assange. She at no point was required to give any reasoning about how she thought Julian Assange would escape the authorities and flee, even though he had this tracking device. And, we all remember a lot of us saw the pictures and images of the embassy.
Yeah.
How it was tracked, how it was under 24/7 surveillance with cops lined up outside the front of the embassy. You got cops in the stairwell staring inside of the windows, trying to see anything that was going on. I don't expect anything different if Julian Assange had been placed on house arrest. And yet, he was kept in Belmarsh prison and not allowed to be put in a home. And importantly, not allowed to be there to live with his fiance and his 2 children while he awaited his appeal date.
Was there any other legal reason given besides the Snowden allegations, or?
Well, primarily it's that she believes he has a history of absconding, of being a flight risk. And the other thing that I can throw out here is this sort of contempt. Well, it's not sort of. It's total contempt for the institution of asylum.
Yes.
Allowing the prosecution to argue that a person seeking asylum can be guilty of jumping bail. And I just don't think that, for our official enemies, as they are declared by the U.S. State Department, I don't believe we would allow this kind of argument to be entertained if, let's say, China or Russia was making this kind of a claim that, going to an embassy means you have jumped bail because you claim asylum. No. Like, we would recognize, we would say that person was fleeing persecution. The same is true for Julian Assange, but he has been accused of flouting the law, especially when the Swedish case started. That was against him. UN Special Rapporteur on Torture Niels Meltzer, without getting into that specific chapter, has documented in great detail the inequities and the miscarriage of justice, the violations of due process rights, the abuses of authority by Swedish prosecutors. And it's been made clear that Julian Assange, first of all, was seeking asylum because of the extradition case that was expected to come down the pike from the U.S. government. It had absolutely nothing to do with dodging whatever Sweden wanted to do with him. And then it was the UK government that refused to and obstructed Swedish prosecutors, or advised them to not come to the Ecuador embassy and question him there. They insisted that he be handed over to Sweden. And it was always a fear. One of the figures I thought about on Monday, who I wish could have seen the extradition request denied, was Center for Constitutional Rights
Michael Ratner.
Michael Ratner, yeah, what I was going to say. And he said all along that the idea was, if Julian was sent to Sweden, then they would be able to hold him, and then the United States would turn around and try and take him, and that he believed the laws there were weaker in order to defend against an extradition. And so, they were hoping not to have to go through the British government to get Julian Assange. And for the most part, everything that's happened in the last 3 to 5 years here has vindicated that viewpoint. And so that's essentially the justification that was laid out by Vanessa Baraitser to keep him in prison.
Yeah, Michael Ratner was a real legendary figure in human rights lawyering from a left perspective. He brought some of the first cases people detained at Guantanamo, both when they were detaining Haitians with HIV, as well as when they were detaining people after 9/11. And he filed a number of cases in the 80s challenging, under the War Powers Act, U.S. military aggression in Latin America and the Caribbean. So he is someone who is very sorely missed. And he was a friend of Defending Rights and Dissent, and we mourn his loss.
And just to say that he comes up in the extradition case as a mentor of Julian Assange, who was lost. There's 2 other figures, but as they point out, one of the reasons that the legal team has had a difficulty preparing for the case is that they lost 3 important figures who could have been witnesses and helped reconstruct the events that had happened, and some of the things that had amounted to abuses of power and evidence of this being a political case. So Michael Ratner would have been somebody who could have taken the stand in defense of Julian. Anyways.
Yeah, he is a loss. His loss is felt. So Mexico has intervened to offer Julian Assange asylum. Can you talk about that? And was that at all factored in to the decision to deny bail?
Yeah, it was.
So because a sovereign state offered a political refugee asylum, that person who is a suicide risk in U.S. prisons must remain in a UK prison with notorious conditions. Is that what you are telling me, Kevin? That cannot possibly be true.
It was despicable. The prosecutor immediately jumped on this and weaponized it against Julian. And so let me just lay down one thing, which is that it's highly unusual for someone who has their extradition rejected for mental health reasons to be kept in prison during their appeal for reasons that you can probably figure out just from common sense. If someone is near the brink of suicide or could at any point be pushed off a cliff towards suicide, you would want to remove the kinds of things that are exacerbating that, like the isolation he is enduring under conditions of lockdown that are being imposed in order to prevent an outbreak, a further outbreak of the coronavirus in the Belmarsh prison. Because there's no social visits. Social visits are banned right now at Belmarsh. And so Mexico made this offer, and the defense presented it this way. They said that the prosecutors were actually being disingenuous about how they characterized the Mexico offer. They essentially said, if this extradition case was over and the appeal had concluded, we would be happy to take Julian Assange and give him asylum, so that in the future, if the US wanted to pursue him with another political case, he would be protected. That's the way the defense presented it. I think that's probably the accurate way of looking at it. They didn't invite him to come to their embassy and avoid going through the appeal, and then the US government would no longer be able to have their way with this political prosecution. It was much more diplomatic, and they made this offer directly to the UK government. It wasn't to Julian Assange. They were saying to the British government that we would take Julian Assange off your hands.
And they just don't want that. They want to hold him some more. So I meant to ask you this earlier when we were talking about the decision to deny extradition, and I apologize for going back. What was the role of the SAMs, or special administrative measures, in reaching, when you were talking about the COVID lockdown? It made me think of those. Could you talk about those, what they are, and what the judge thought of them?
Yeah, so the SAMs, these special administrative measures, are something that the Attorney General of the Justice Department can particularly authorize. And then those people are basically kept in conditions that are tantamount to, let's say, solitary confinement plus. It's so, you have maybe 22 to 23 hours that you're kept in your cell. Then on top of that, there are additional restrictions. There's a limitation as to who in your family and whether you could even contact friends, how many times a month. It could be 2 15-minute calls a month that you are restricted to under SAMs. And then your mail constantly will be rifled through even more extensively, more inspections than even a standard prisoner would have to endure. It could take months for something that's sent to you to arrive. So we're talking about FBI inspections of your mail. You can probably kiss goodbye any legally privileged conversations, because someone's going to be monitoring what is being said, although they may pay lip service to your attorneys. You could probably bet that somehow they know what you're talking about. And so this is Sam's, and this is what he would have to likely endure. And people who have gone through this, who are put in, it's called the H unit in ADX Florence, have described this sort of nightmare of basically sinking deeper and deeper and deeper into an abyss. And there are horrible, horrible stories out there of people committing self-harm to get out of these conditions. I don't know how graphic you're going to let me be, but things like
We are a free speech organization.
Ingesting shards of glass in order to get out of the conditions that are being imposed on you is how far people are willing to go because of the psychological torment that they are feeling in these conditions. This is like a feature of the Supermax prison. This is well known, and there have been lawsuits brought against ADX Florence for the way that they have set up this unit.
Yeah, and thank you for elaborating that point. So, another issue that came up that the judge rejected was the allegations about UC Global spying on Assange and his defense. And I believe she cited that it would be inappropriate for her to make a ruling since the Spanish were still investigating that. Could you talk about the state of that investigation in Spain and what's the significance of that?
First, she actually justified the surveillance operation.
Oh, good for her.
Great
judge.
She said, I could see why they would be spying on Julian Assange, and referenced a very clear example of media malpractice on the part of CNN, who had published an article about how they claimed Assange had turned the embassy into an election meddling command post. And this was published. I actually wrote an article about this at Shadowproof, digging into it because I noticed that the documents that CNN had were the exact same documents that El País had from UC Global, the spying firm that is facing that the director of this firm, David Morales, is facing criminal allegations. I noticed that El País looked at these documents and they were concerned about how the legal team was targeted with surveillance and how the microphones were in the women's bathroom or other parts of the embassy. And they put one in a fire extinguisher and they were trying to pick up what Julian Assange was talking about with his lawyers. That was what they thought was a priority to cover in the documents. CNN decided to take these documents and set it next to the Mueller investigation and fabricate a narrative about what they believed Julian Assange was likely doing while he was in the embassy to undermine American democracy. And they essentially were laundering a CIA narrative through the publication of this article. And then now it effectively made it into the extradition decision as something to justify the criminalization of Julian Assange, a publisher. So the status of the UC Global case, the offenses against it, is that we're at a standstill. The United States refuses to cooperate and hand over information that has been requested by the Spanish judge. It's rather similar to the way in which the U.S. government refused to cooperate in, I believe there was a Spanish case at one point that wanted to look into torture by the Bush administration. So they refused to cooperate and hand over any information. In fact, they sort of made a kind of unreasonable offer to the judge where they said, okay, we will answer your questions, but you have to tell us the names or reveal the identities of the whistleblowers who have come forward to you. It's absolutely absurd. Nobody is going to agree to that. These are people who work underneath a man who has military experience in Spain, and if their identities were revealed, already at least one of them is living under witness protection. But if their identities were known, then everybody knows them and they're not protected anymore, and anyone could come and ambush them and do violence to them and their families. So they're never going to agree to reveal the identities of these people. And of course, that's the point. That's what the U.S. government wants, is to say that you'll either wholly compromise the integrity of this or else you're just going to be at a standstill and we're not going to cooperate. And so that's where we are right now. I don't know what happens next. They aren't able to get the information they need. The Spanish court isn't able to get the information it needs in order to complete. And apparently, El País reported that there's some more confirmation of how the CIA was using this in order to further the extradition case, but they need to talk to lawyers who were targeted, and they've not been able to get them to provide testimony yet.
Yeah, and the U.S. has a long history of refusing information for inquiries that implicate its intelligence services, even going back before the torture investigation. It was either in the 90s or early 2000s. The CIA and the U.S. refused to provide information to the Italian Parliamentary Inquiry on Terrorism, which the significance of which might not be known to some people, but there are some allegations about the U.S.'s involvement in the years of lead, to put it mildly, that have never been properly resolved. And I will not say more on that, since I will be carted off as a conspiracy theorist. But yeah, so I guess my final question for you is, so CNN did that article where they sort of tied to the Mueller investigation. We know now that Mueller decided not to charge Julian Assange.
That's correct.
Yep.
So, I mean, if you want me to address the elephant in the room, which is, did Julian have anything to do with any Russian interference? I mean, the answer to this is, at some point I'm going to pull out the clip, because there was actually a panel discussion that was done recently in which there was a bit of a revelation about Julian Assange's position on revealing his source as far as who provided the emails to him. But you might recall that I think we might have talked about this just a little bit, but it was suggested by his lawyers that at some point a pardon offer was made to him by Dana Rohrabacher, who was a congressman. At the time, he would have been a former congressman. He was no longer in Congress, but he made some representation that he was visiting Julian on behalf of Trump, and he would be willing to offer Julian Assange a pardon if Julian would help resolve the issues that Donald Trump was having with the Russia investigation by revealing his sources and saying who gave him the email. And Julian Assange simply said, I can't do that. The reputation of WikiLeaks is to keep sources confidential. If I were to tell you who did it, even if that person is okay with that, and I know the person came to me, and I can tell you it's not someone who's from a state entity, but still, nonetheless, I have a duty to keep that person's name unknown, because if I do that, then people are going to think that maybe in the future WikiLeaks would reveal sources. And so, no, I'm not going to cooperate. And that was a potential shot at ending this political prosecution. However, he decided to not be an ally of the Trump administration, and he rejected this informal pardon offer, if you believe the narrative that the Assange legal team presented during the extradition trial. And so I think that's important for all of us who believe that WikiLeaks was somehow compromised during the Trump campaign. In addition to the fact that people who have made statements about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks turned out to be fabricators and total liars, like Roger Stone. But on top of that, you have this episode here, where Julian Assange totally rejected an opportunity to get out from under the cloud of investigation.
And in addition to the CNN article, the judge also referenced a Guardian article too, right? How unprecedented is that, and what's the significance of that, since the Guardian also did a very moving op-ed, I believe several moving op-eds or editorials about why Assange should not be extradited, and yet here she is citing a Guardian story to justify blocking his press freedom claims.
Well, so first of all, I'm glad that any news organization is speaking out about Assange, but the thing is, this flurry of op-eds comes about a week to 2 weeks before the decision is going to be handed down, and I'm not sure what impact it has on the ultimate outcome. The time to speak up and publish these op-eds was when the indictments were handed down initially. And so across the board, when it comes to the establishment media, not just the Guardian, I wish people had published these columns immediately, like some of the press freedom organizations that stood up. I mean, I think that goes for journalists unions as well. I wish they had spoken up more forcefully sooner, because it might have had more of an effect on the nature of the judge's decision. But that being said, the Guardian article that was referenced by the judge is an article that, in retrospect, um, shows that they did not understand what was happening with the unredacted cables. They were induced into a panic, and they published an article that condemned WikiLeaks for publishing an unredacted batch of all of the 250,000 plus cables all at once. But what they did not understand is what had happened, and they did not take responsibility for the fact that David Lee and Luke Harding wrote a book about WikiLeaks and used as one of the chapter headings the password key that was for an encrypted file, and it was still active. That encrypted file was still out there on the internet. It's not like it was taken down. And that key eventually, by some sleuthing, was connected to that file. It was written about by a German publication called Der Freitag, and Freitag ended up making this connection, and so now people were able to uh, look at unredacted cables. People were able to go through this material, and now anyone in there who had previously had their names removed in order to protect them was at risk. And so Julian Assange, there's actual video of him getting on the phone with the State Department. There's also audio that has been published of him talking to the counsel of the State Department, saying you have to do something about this. People's lives are in danger. Yet you read this Guardian editorial that was published, or this column, which, by the way, came from a disaffected person who had been a part of WikiLeaks. So that suggests that this column was written because this person had some kind of animosity for how WikiLeaks had treated them previously, or how Julian Assange had treated them. And so you look at this article in retrospect and you see it does not represent the actual chain of events that happened. And in fact, WikiLeaks was not the first to publish. We know that Cryptome published all of the cables online before WikiLeaks actually posted the archive of unredacted material. And yet this is not reflected in Vanessa Baretzer's decision.
Yeah, I believe the video or the tape of him talking to the State Department has emerged recently, and it's really something to hear. So I guess my final question for you, I think I've said final question several times and then tacked on 5 questions every time, but okay. We're all in lockdown, so
you can ask a follow-up to your final question.
Yes, but my actual final question, I think, is what is next for Assange here, and for those who want to advocate for press freedom and advocate for Julian Assange, what's the best avenue for freeing him?
Let me just say one thing, because we actually know who Joe Biden picked for Attorney General is now, Merrick Garland. And before we did this webinar, I was online looking to see if I could find anything that Merrick Garland had said about WikiLeaks previously, or if he's ever weighed in on the Espionage Act, or if there's anything related to this case that could help me deduce how he would feel, beyond the fact that he's a pretty pragmatic person as far as his career in the courts, and he usually takes a pretty establishment position. So I was able to find nothing at this point, and I don't know if we have any indication as to what it would mean if Merrick Garland is the Attorney General, and how that would affect the outcome. Going forward, where this case goes next, I think there are 3 points that should be made. First, the appeal is going to be officially submitted by the U.S. government. They will go before the High Court of Justice. It should take place over the next few months. I don't expect it to take a year or longer. It's going to be in 2021. well, I'll get to that next. So it'll be in 2021, and they'll go before the High Court, and they won't be arguing about the criminal allegations. They'll be arguing that the judge was wrong to believe that the U.S. incarceration system is cruel and inhumane and would lead to Julian Assange taking his own life. So then Joe Biden will be president, and the Justice Department can decide what kind of energy and resources it wants to put into this case, or it could drop the charges. And I think that for people out there who are interested in campaigning and trying to bring this to an end, especially since the extradition request was rejected, I believe that this group of people who have been saying this case should not be ongoing and unfolding anymore, they have more support than ever. They have more grounds to make this call than ever because the judge has said Julian Assange should not be extradited. So they should immediately try and figure out what the position of the Biden Justice Department will be on this case, knowing full well that back in 2013, the prosecutors in the Justice Department who were considering bringing a case against Assange balked and decided to not indict Julian Assange after they had successfully prosecuted Chelsea Manning, or after military prosecutors had succeeded in convicting her in a military trial. And I think that's something that people really must do. And then beyond that, obviously, I think the pressure has to be ramped up to free Julian Assange from Belmarsh prison, to see if there's any way to get a reconsideration of bail. I don't know what kind of mechanisms are available. I don't know if there's going to be a way to challenge the bail decision at the High Court of Justice, but there should be pressure on the British government, at least, to no longer allow this to be the case, that this person is in a high security prison and in a vulnerable spot, especially during an intense pandemic.
Yeah, and I think those are all good points. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I mentioned in your introduction you were credentialed to cover the Assange case, but you also covered daily the Manning court-martial. I believe the only person who did daily coverage of both the Manning court-martial and the Assange extradition. You've covered some of the hearings in Reality Winner's case, and you are probably the best journalist in the United States today covering the ongoing war on whistleblowers and abuse of the Espionage Act. So it is always an honor and a privilege to talk to you. And for people watching, how can they find your work?
Yeah, so I've got my Twitter handle on the webinar, so people can easily follow if you're not already familiar. And then I'll just quickly plug this newsletter that I have going, which is called The Dissenter. It's at dissenter.substack.com, dissenter.substack.com, which covers whistleblower stories as well as puts out regular WikiLeaks updates. I've used it to share my coverage of the Assange proceedings. And then for people who do decide to subscribe, there will be exclusive content and deeper dives into these issues, which I think you all can appreciate. So thank you very much, Chip, for having me on to talk. I really enjoyed having this conversation.
And I am a Dissenter subscriber, so I can give my warranty that it's great. And for people who want to learn more about defending rights in dissent, please come to rightsinDissent.org. And I want to say we still have an action up about Assange at rightsinDissent.org/take-action. It is an action calling on Donald Trump to pardon everyone unjustly convicted or indicted under the Espionage Act. Right now, as we're speaking, there are active Espionage Act charges against Daniel Hale, Julian Assange, and Edward Snowden, and Reality Winner and Terry Albury are in prison. And we are calling on Donald Trump to free those people. If there ever was a case for a pardon, it is a national security whistleblower charged under the Espionage Act, because the Espionage Act, as written, allows no meaningful defense for a whistleblower to present in court. Daniel Ellsberg historically was charged in the Espionage Act. was asked by his lawyer, why'd you leak the Pentagon Papers? The judge intervened and said, you can't ask him that question. And his attorney, Louis Baudouin, a very famous radical attorney, said, I've never been not able to ask a client this question before. And the judge says, well, now you have, which is also why we worked to draft and support the Protect Brave Whistleblowers Act, which would have amended that. So there's a lot going on at rightsindissent.org. We were the first group to organize a protest on behalf of Chelsea Manning. We were one of the first to organize a protest on behalf of Reality Winner. And we brought Kevin to speak to you 3 times in 1 year about Assange, and 1 more time about Joe Biden. So please visit us at rightsindissent.org and go to rightsindissent.org/take-action to tell Donald Trump right now to end these unjust Espionage Act prosecutions, though I don't know what Trump is really doing at the moment anymore.
Decompressing.
Decompressing, yes. Vibing, perhaps. He's vibing. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Thank you for joining us.